Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. And I apologize that I'm the one and only because I know that Marcus has a really great presentation to give you. So hopefully you guys can watch that or listen to that at your convenience. So I decided to take the opportunity to go a little deeper in my talk and go a little bit what I like to call everything you ever wanted to know about forest carbon, but were afraid to ask. No, I'm just joking. I'm not gonna stay here for the entire 2.5 hours. I will stay here as long as you would like. But I was asked to give really an overview of forests and forest products as they relate to climate policy and climate strategies in Washington state, with a particular focus on the small family landowners. Just a little more of a background about me. So I actually grew up in the Northeast, and then I was a research forester for international paper a long time ago in the Southeast. And then I've been out here in the Pacific Northwest for about over 20 years. And I think that it's really important to understand about context in the different places, both different forest types, different markets, different drivers for things. You will see in this discussion as I go forward that even within Washington state, there's a lot of context and a lot of different strategies depending on where you are in the state. I also am one of these people that I have a science background, but I have spent a lot of time in sort of bridging the gap between science and policy and management, and that's sort of where my niche is. So I have kind of a different perspective than some people. So today I'm going to first give an overview of the forest carbon cycle. And then I'm going to set the stage for Washington state and Washington state's forests by landowner type and by forest type, and harvest and manufacturing, just so that we're kind of all grounded. A lot of this you know already, but we're sort of all on the same page when we start having a discussion of sort of what those forest sector strategies are to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. And then how does this relate to policy? So I'm going to go over two things that are recent related to Washington state. So one was the House Bill 2528 that passed last year. And then the other one is the status of Washington DNR Carbon Sequestration Advisory Committee, which I am serving a member on. And then I will go into some conversation about some incentives, possible incentives for small landowners of how to have what I like to result is it's really healthy, resilient, robust, productive forests that are good for climate and good for carbon and good for all the other ecosystems that forests provide. Okay. Oh, and the other thing is, as we're going forward, I am happy to take clarifying questions as they come up in the chat. I will probably save sort of the discussion-oriented ones until later. But if there's something that that you really don't understand, or of course, if my screen freezes and you no longer can hear me, please, someone let me know. All right, so the Forest Service has put together some really great figures if you haven't seen these, and I think they're really helpful in sort of grounding yourself in forest carbon and how that relates to forest growth and all of the dynamics of forest growth. So really the bottom line is, once you guys who are forest landowners, you know about how forests are dynamic over space and time. You know that trees grow, and you know that trees also die due to either mortality events, due to fire, due to insect outbreaks, many different scenarios. And then there's also harvest. What this picture is showing is that within the first, just take away humans from this at all, but just in nature, carbon and carbon stocks are always in flux in nature. So you can have times when trees are growing, you can have times when they're sort of stagnant, and you can have times when there's a disturbance and then followed by a regrowth. But it is a circle, and that is a kind of a really important thing, that trees take in CO2 and store it in their cellulose when they are growing and when they are in harvested wood products. And then trees release carbon dioxide at the time of decay or combustion. So this closed loop is also true when you add in the harvest component. And that's also a really important thing, that you can have a harvest event and you can turn that, that carbon or that log into a wood product that just delays the carbon from being re-released back into the atmosphere. And this is fundamentally different than fossil fuel, which is a one-way street. So trees and vegetation are a two-way street. They can either take CO2 out of the atmosphere or they can put it back in the atmosphere. Fossil fuel, just a one-way street. So here's where we get into some terminology that, frankly, if you guys can get this, you are 95% more knowledgeable than frankly, most policymakers that are focused on climate change. So, so I think this is going to be a key source of terminology over the course of many years. You have four major pools, carbon pools of carbon in the world. So you have your vegetation pool, that's a lot forest, but also in soils as well. You have your fossil fuel reserves, which, yes, ultimately did come from decaying vegetation, but it's on a geologic timescale that's different than the vegetation that is right now. So we call it a separate pool, the fossil fuel pool. And then you have your ocean pool, which consists of dissolved organic carbon. And then you have your atmospheric carbon pool, which is the CO2 that exists in the atmosphere. So the exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean is also a two-way street. But this is really done just by the difference in concentration between the atmosphere and the ocean. So the more concentrated CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the more it's going to go into the ocean. This is just kind of basic chemistry there. Fossil fuel is only a one-way street on a geologic timescale. So you can only go from being stored to being released into the atmosphere. Vegetation, as we just described in the last few, are that two-way street. So you can have CO2 coming out of the atmosphere and into the vegetation through the process of photosynthesis, and then you can have it going back into the atmosphere through the process of decay, respiration, and wildfire. And these are the pools that are often also referred to as stocks. And then the change in these pools are what's known as either stock change, if you're measuring the change of a pool in time 1 versus time 2, or they're known as a flux, a net flux, which is the difference between the gross emissions one way and the gross sequestration the other way. So net flux is the same as stock change. Okay. But this is the relative sort of chart for the global carbon cycle. So the Forest Service has taken the the measurements that are associated with the forests in the US and equated it in this nice little analogy of bathtub. So I'm not going to go into the actual numbers here, but basically the forests are your bathtub, and then the growth of the trees is the carbon that's entering into the tub, and then what's leaving the tub is going to be the either wildfire emissions or land use change or harvesting or just general mortality. So the bathtub is where, let's see, the bathtub is where is the relative change in the pools of carbon. So, and I just got a question here about increases in atmospheric carbon. Do they help increase plant growth, which then in turn takes carbon out of the atmosphere? So yes, it is true. This is what's known as carbon dioxide fertilization. In certain situations, in many situations, if you're going to have an increase in CO2, then you have more of an ability for photosynthesis to occur on a regular basis. Increases in CO2 also changes temperature, which then can increase wildfire emissions, can affect snow melt, which then affects the amount of water that's available. So it's a really, it's not quite self-balancing, and it really is kind of depending on where you are in terms of what the impact will be, whether or not the trees are going to end up being more productive or less productive. But that's a really great question. So my next slide here is talking about how we know about these carbon stocks and carbon fluxes. And in the US, we have an incredible program that you may or may not be aware of, but it is called the Forest FIA, Forest Inventory Analysis. And these are a set of permanent plots that have been set out across the entire United States, designed to be statistically robust at a state level. This is just an example for the number of plots that are in Washington state. They are measured periodically on a rolling basis, such that in the West, in Washington, for example, every 10 years, a plot will get remeasured. In the East, it's actually done on a 5-year periodic scale. And some of the states in the West are trying to increase that measurement. These plots give us a wealth of knowledge, not just about carbon, but really about forest health, disturbances, inventory. They've been used to compile all of the national level reports that sort of go into what the state of the US forests are. And they also are used and submitted to the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, as part of the US Greenhouse Gas Inventory Report. And they are used to show that forests in the US right now, currently, are taking in more carbon dioxide. So they're growing more trees every year than they are releasing due to harvesting or wildfires. I'm going to be showing you some detailed results from Washington State that the FIA folks in the Pacific Northwest Research Group have put together for the DNR that has been discussed in the CSAG, the Carbon Sequestration Advisory Group, which I will also talk to you about in a little bit. They gave me permission to give you these reports, recognizing that they're draft right now. And also they wanted to give me to give you a super shout out that these plots are across all land ownership types, including private landowners, including small private landowners. They are, nobody knows where they are. So if you are a landowner, you won't know where the plot is, but you will be asked permission to access the plot, to remeasure the plot. And it is super important that if you are comfortable with that, that you allow that permission, because that is how we are able to have sort of an accurate and robust understanding of our forest health and how good our forests are, or where there's a problem at a large level, not at a plot level. I want to emphasize that there is zero recognition to a particular landowner. So with that, I just want to go back a little bit in time, back to the U.S. level, and help you understand some trends in terms of carbon flux and carbon stock change. So as I mentioned before in the very first slide that we did about the carbon cycle, that naturally forests are always in some sort of flux, right? So some trees may be in the process of growing, some trees are kind of at their senescence and starting to sort of die off, fall over from wind. Maybe there's an insect that comes in. And sometimes you'll get stand replacing disturbances, so a large wildfire, so a large release of CO2. But in general, in the US, prior to sort of the 1750s-ish, though all of those natural disturbances kind of evened each other out, such that there was really no net sequestration. So the US right now is a huge sequester of trees, but the reason why is because we went through a long period of time where we were cutting down a heck of a lot of trees, mainly for land use change. So if anyone has been to the northeastern United States, or heck, anywhere in the southeastern United States, that early on was all forest, and then for a period of about 100 years there was not a lick of trees on the ground, so it was all farmland. And those trees have come back. You know, kind of, you can see this graph down, the green is the area of forest land, and the lowest point was kind of the late 1800s. And in forest land has kind of been stable or increasing ever since then. And carbon sequestration has also sort of flipped from being a huge net source of emissions to, since about the 1950s, we've been growing more trees than we have been harvesting or losing them to mortality or fires. On the right here, however, this is a prediction from the U.S. Forest Service that looks at a couple different scenarios of population growth and GDP and climate, and predicts that actually that huge sequestration offsetting that we have enjoyed as a nation will start to diminish over time, and actually we may flip to being as a nation a source by 2060. The reason, there are kind of two primary reasons for that. One is population pressure, particularly in the Southeast, so land use change due to development. And the second one is disturbances from wildfire fires and insect outbreaks, particularly in the West. And in fact, in the most recent national greenhouse gas inventory, the US Forest Service folks looked at net flux, so that's that carbon stock change by state, and kind of for the first time in many decades, a few of these Intermountain West states popped up to being a source of emissions. So this is a little bit weird because the bars that go up and the black dot on the up means that they are a net emitter. So it's a positive, and the bars in the states on the bottom means they're a net sequesterer. So they're growing more than they're releasing. So the states that have popped up to releasing more are the states in, let's see, Colorado. We could probably just say them and then confirm. Yeah, Idaho, Montana, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. So it's kind of that Intermountain West, largely driven by wildfire and insect outbreaks. You can see here on the right that Washington is solidly a net sequesterer of carbon. So we are still, as a state, growing more trees than we are emitting due to mortality or harvest. There we go. and why is that for Washington State? Well, you guys know Washington is a great place to grow trees. So it actually, this is a fun fact, has the highest percentage of forest area that's in the highest productivity class. So we have, great site ability to grow trees, and the trees we grow can grow for a long period of time. And especially in the western parts of Washington State, we've got the rainfall, and we've got kind of all of the things that are needed to grow some really great trees. These trees are also, in particular, Douglas fir, kind of the perfect wood building material. The perfect characteristics. And Washington State plays a global role in providing wood products. So the US as a whole is actually the largest producer of industrial roundwood, which is the wood that goes into all forest products. And it's also the largest producer of sawnwood, so sort of the saw timber piece. Although these numbers are actually slightly incorrect right now. China has now surpassed the US, but they're not sourcing their wood from within China. So I still say the US is number one here. And then in terms of where you're producing wood products, it's in the Pacific Northwest. So Oregon actually holds the highest percentage, but Washington is close behind with 12% of forest products, of saw timber products coming out of Washington State. Washington State is also a good place from a climate perspective. Manufacture forest products and actually manufacture anything. So this is an example here of the dots are how many greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by the pulp and paper facilities. So the bigger the dot, the more emissions you have. And you can really generally equate that to the more emissions there are, the more likely are that they have coal as a source of some of their energy in use. But pulp and paper facilities mainly use biomass energy, and then when they their remaining energy and their electricity use is from the area, and we just have a relatively, especially in electricity due to hydro, a relatively low carbon intensity network system. So you've got all of these situations in play to have Washington just have, I think, from a climate perspective, a competitive advantage in the forests, in both being able to grow incredible trees and also to make a wood product that also has a climate benefit. I got an email here about, does the Forest Service no low management scenario contribute to net carbon emissions? And yes, we are going to be discussing that as we piece out the Washington state diagram. So I will hold off on answering that. This is just, I pulled this together. It's a little bit hard to look at here, but just to give you an idea of where the timber harvest is happening, which you probably all know, that the majority of timber harvest in Washington state is in private lands, west side forest. The second would be followed by state land, so the DNR and west side forest. So this whole basically 85% of harvest comes from the west side of the Cascades. In the east side of the Cascades, there's that remaining 15%, and of that, there's 11% of that is from the private east side forests. So again, 75% or 76% of total harvest comes from private, and 80% of harvest comes from west side forests. Just in terms of what types of forest products are manufactured in Washington, this is from a study that was done out of the University of Washington that took the harvest reports and where the harvest ended up and developed this wood product mix. And in Washington state, the majority of harvest actually goes into lumber, into saw timber, which makes sense because that's kind of the competitive advantage of a Douglas fir. I will emphasize, and you all know this as well, that in order to grow those nice saw timber trees, you also need a market for the lower value material. And so it's really important to have the other products, especially paper, or if there's another way that you can deal with low value material, this smaller diameter timber or the tops and limbs, that's also super important. So here we're going to go into a little bit of parsing out what's happening on different land ownership types in Washington state. Just going to lay this out a little bit. So the green is the growth, the gross growth. So how much trees are growing by ownership category per acre. So this is not, it's not weighted for ownership share, it's just per acre. And you can see on this that corporate ownership kind of makes sense. They're growing the most, but they're also harvesting the most. So that's where the majority of sort of activity is coming on. The non-corporate lands are growing. They're not harvesting nearly as much as corporate. And so your net, that dot in the middle, is actually where you're changing your carbon stock. So your net sequestering is higher than some of the other categories. Then you start to get into the U.S. Forest Service, and unfortunately, I don't have the slide that breaks it out by east side, west side. I wish I did, because that's where everything gets very clear. But you do see that Forest Service is harvesting very little. They're still growing, and especially I would say in those west side forests, they're still growing quite a bit and putting on a lot of sequestration. But there's also mortality, and this is getting more and more in there. When you looked at the chart, which I didn't have, but when you looked at the chart of national forests in east side versus west side, you will see that the growth on the east side forests is lower, and the mortality due to insects and disease and fire is like way more, relatively speaking. So, and then you'll see in all ownership types, the increase is higher. So we're a net sequester. So this is another way of looking at this, and this is from the same University of Washington study that took into account, just on private forest lands, the annual net sequestration. This was done for 2015 as a point in time, and then took a look at the wood products that were harvested from that year and calculated essentially the climate benefit of those wood products by taking into account the temporary storage of where that product ended up. And that can be done by taking into account the fact that of any saw timber, you're going to have a certain amount that's going to end up in a single family home, a certain amount that ends up in a multifamily, a certain amount that ends up as furniture, or whatever the end use is. Each one of those end uses has a specific half-life. So you're able to kind of figure out that weighted average of what a half-life is, depending on what type of harvest it is. And from that, you can calculate the climate benefit of keeping a product out of the atmosphere, a carbon out of the atmosphere for a certain period of time. So that number equates to 4.3 million metric tons of CO2 from the wood products that are harvested off of private lands. And so together, that's a climate benefit of 11.7 million metric tons, which for Washington State offset about 12.7. This was the 2013 greenhouse gas emissions of the state. So about 12.7% of Washington State's greenhouse gas emissions. I'm gonna go back to the FIA, back to the land stuff a little bit, because this also gets a little bit at what we were talking about with some of the differences in growth and mortality in the different areas. So on the West Cascades, you see, this is kind of the change in carbon pools here. So you see that there's an awful lot of growth in trees, and not as much change in standing dead or down or understory, etc. On the flip side of that, in the East Cascades, you see that there's hardly any any change in live trees, which kind of means that they're kind of staying the same. There's an increase in standing dead trees, and overall sort of that total change in carbon pools is lower than, or it's about, I guess it's about zero. So this is just another way of looking at the carbon fluxes by ecoregion. So now that we know sort of where we are and the context of what Washington State is doing, the question is, how does that fit into a strategy to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions? And there's a general consensus sort of worldwide, that there are sort of kind of 6 general strategies that the forest sector can do in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but they're really broken out into 2 buckets. So one is taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere, and one is preventing CO2 from going back into the atmosphere. So to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, you can plant more trees. You can increase the carbon density or stocks in existing forests, and you can increase the stock of wood product carbon storage. So put more carbon into the wood product pool, or alternatively extend the amount of use from that wood product pool. You can then reduce emissions that go into the atmosphere from the forest point of view by reducing deforestation or degradation from wildfire. You can use biomass for energy to replace fossil fuels, and you can use wood products that generally have a lower, take less energy to manufacture than their alternative materials. So you're avoiding the use of fossil fuels in making those alternative materials. So for Washington State, I'm going to keep this super simple for you guys, because now we're going to start to get into policy. It's plant more trees, keep working forests, reduce excess emissions from uncharacteristic fire and mortality events, increasing carbon density of existing forests, and use and produce more wood products. Now, what happens is there becomes, in these last 2 bullet points, there becomes a little bit of a tension on where to do that and how to do that. Because if you are increasing carbon in a forest, you may result in reducing harvest. You don't always have to, but that's sort of where all of our tensions exist. And this really gets blown up in some of the policy world. And each state has kind of their own different way of dealing with that tension. So in Washington, the forest sector last year had some really heart-to-heart conversations about, what role the forest sector could play and how important that is for Washington State. And due to all of the things that I've just told you about, Washington and its natural growing and its wood products, and also the results that were identified in Ganguly, the University of Washington paper, they put together an act that was passed last year, HB 2528, and it relates to the contributions of the state forest product sector to the global climate response. So it does kind of 4 things. It introduces this concept that forest and forest products can play a role in climate mitigation, and that the forest sector is indivisible. So it's not just about the forest side. It's not just about manufacturing. It's not just about one type of manufacturing. It's really that whole piece. It finds that Washington State is a net sequester of carbon, and it amends the greenhouse gas emissions limit bill to support industry sectors that act as sequesters of carbon, and says that if there's basically any future carbon policy or climate policy, that they have to recognize that the important role that both forests and forest products play in a climate response. So that was a really important piece that kind of sets the stage moving forward. There are no immediate actions that took place on it, but it was a good, important piece to get through. The other the other sort of policy piece that's been in the works that actually was put in an appropriations bill the year before in 2019 was really understanding more about opportunities to increase carbon sequestration in Washington's forests, particularly focused on private and non-state forest owners. And then also to really understand the forest and wood product inventory. So they were given money to provide a report. The DNR was given money to provide a report to the state legislature that's due in December 1st that summarizes forest inventory, both the forest and wood products inventory, some of the information that I already showed you. And then the second thing was to compile existing opportunities for carbon compensation and other incentive-based carbon reducing programs. That's really important. Existing programs and summarize the barriers. They formed a carbon sequestration advisory group that was made up of, I think it's about 25 members, balanced group of members. And together have been kind of walking through the results of the inventory report and the incentive programs, and will help provide the report to the legislature. So, and then there was a new section, yes, on House Bill 2528 for conservation district. Yes, so unfortunately, the House bill had two other sections that were associated with the bill that actually didn't end up making it into the bill, but they're still worth talking about. So one of them was essentially to provide a reforestation fund that was going to be, initially was going to be, it's sort of, there were some, the initial bill had it that the conservation districts was going to be overseeing it, and then there was discussion of whether DNR would oversee it. The bottom line is it didn't end up making it through to the bill, but the idea was to provide essentially a funding mechanism to have reforestation in areas that are currently either like marginal ag lands, riparian buffer for ag lands, or lands that have had stand replacing fires and are not regenerating. I don't know if you saw the lovely picture I had of just a burnt out forest. That was from the Tunk complex fire 5 years ago. Nothing is growing 5 years later. So those types of things. So that's kind of all I have on that, but it's an interesting idea that hopefully will get legs at another point in time. In terms of the incentives, so these are just, and again, the report will sort of highlight and summarize these. So I'm really giving you the sort of draft thinking of the time, but they're really they're basically, they're two types of incentive programs. So one is sort of the practice-based incentive programs. So these are things that are already in place through the Conservation Reserve Program or NRCS, and those are payments that are not necessarily for carbon, but they have a carbon benefit associated to them. And then the other piece of it is through a traditional carbon market, which has some significant barriers for small landowners, but there's a lot of focus on trying to break those barriers that I'll talk about in a second. And then in terms of like what the different buckets are, there's sort of the planting more trees, there's avoiding deforestation, so avoiding conversion, and there's that forest management piece, which is focused both on forest health side as well as increasing carbon density, which could be in the west side, increasing rotation ages, et cetera. And then the final piece is that there is a strong recognition that if you're kind of priming the pump, the market pump, that helps with a lot of these other ones. It certainly helps with avoided conversion. It could help with reforestation. It can help with a whole number of things, but there really isn't a direct link on the carbon side on the harvested wood product piece. So that's kind of been identified as a little bit of a gap there. I'm not gonna go into details on these because you probably know all of these, but these were some of the examples of these practice-based incentive programs that are designed to help perform specific practices and do a cost share to perform specific practices on landowners. And these are the ones that are directed at small landowner programs. A lot of these programs are pretty, they're nationwide, and they're used in a lot more in other states, not as much in, well, the Healthy Forest Reserve is used here, but some of the conservation stewardship programs are used more frequently in other states. The other piece of this is just on carbon markets. This is kind of the way that you have a direct payment for what you are doing on your land from someone who is interested in offsetting. And that can come from either someone who is a company that is regulated through a compliance-based system, such as a company that operates out of California, or more and more through a voluntary-based system, just companies that have made their own goals and targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there are two different protocols that are applicable for forests that have some different requirements depending on whether you're in the compliance market or the voluntary market. So this is a really great diagram that Dylan Jenkins of Finite Carbon, who's a project developer, had put together to describe essentially how you get credit in the compliance, the California offset protocol, which you can do in any state in the US, though they have some specific environmental sideboards that really are applicable more to California. Nevertheless, it takes what your stand inventory is now and compares it to the FIA mean. And so you could, if you are harvesting, or if you haven't harvested, if you own only a small piece of land and haven't harvested in a while, you could be above kind of where your average is for your forest type. And that would be an initial bump of offset credits, but you are required to hold that amount of carbon for 100 years. And it's actually 100 years after you've sold your last credit. So if you decide, oh, I want to keep growing and I want to sell more credits and I want to go, every time you sell something, you have to hold it for 100 years after. There's also a huge amount of measuring and monitoring costs that are associated that really makes it really hard for a small landowner to enter into that system. And when I say small landowner, I mean they usually say that like 5,000 acres is where it starts to potentially pencil out. The American Carbon Registry Improved Forest Management Protocol is an example of a voluntary protocol. So this would be, you know, selling to the companies, and I'm just throwing names out there, but large tech companies that have made climate commitments, others that are doing this for corporate social responsibility, and then those that also feel like there will be regulation potentially in the future, and so they want to sort of get a hold on that. And in this particular protocol, you're comparing where your management is now versus what you are legally allowed to do. So that could potentially end up with more credits available to sell, not necessarily. I see a question of, would not harvesting to grow put at risk? Yes. So all of these projects do require you to legally be allowed to harvest, and they do also encourage you to continue to harvest. In fact, I think a lot of them actually specify you have to have some sort of harvest in there. It's just a question of how much harvesting you're going to do, but that is definitely an important piece associated with that. So this one, again, this is a 40-year as opposed to 100 years. But again, it's also in the voluntary offset. Your companies are not as sure whether or not this will be accepted in the future roll. So usually the prices are lower associated with it. All of them also require you to go out and measure, not you yourself, but require someone to go out and measure and monitor and have on-site verification. So what this does, so these carbon markets are around, and unfortunately, they are not of benefit right now to the majority of small landowners. This is a chart that's taken partnership with the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation that really highlights very well. So family forests are 290 million acres of forest land in the US, which is more than 30% of total private land, more than the US Forest Service. And the carbon projects that are associated, the registered carbon projects, you see they are 99% of the projects that are currently in the carbon market. This has long been recognized as a big barrier and also a big opportunity. A lot of folks are working on how to open this up to provide some real benefits and opportunity for increased sequestration on small forest landowners. So just a couple things that I will describe. I don't know what happened to my. I swear I'm at the last slide. Now I can't. Somehow my. Let's see if I can. Can you guys see this? There we go. Okay. So there are a couple different options that are on the horizon that are being talked about right now. So there's the carbon offset aggregators, and they are really focused on reducing that measuring and monitoring cost. They'll operate under those same protocols, but will be focused on innovative mapping technology and ways to reduce the measuring and monitoring costs so that you can pool together a bunch of different small landowners. There's a rental payment discussion that a company called Sylvia Terra is working on that also is focusing on mapping. And then there's another program that I am involved in that's more of a hybrid. It's a programmatic offset. The way that one's going to work is to the landowner, it is going to look more like a payment for a particular practice. And the length of commitment will be Also, a reasonable length of commitment, you know, in the 10 to 20 year time frame. It will be focused on actual changes in practice. So whether that's in a place that needs thinning for forest fire resiliency, or reforestation after stand replacing fire, or increasing of riparian buffers, a lot of different kind of practices that could be employed. And then the actual measuring and monitoring will take place at the programmatic level, and will rely on essentially using your project measurement against the FIA, creating a control against FIA plots that are started off in your same likeness. There's another voluntary protocol that's in development right now that will be addressing how this all works. So I'm going to end here. The bottom line for this is, I know I've just bombarded you with a whole bunch of information. And I know that carbon can be a pretty confusing issue. And I want, more than anything, for you guys who know the trees, you know your land, to have assurance that that is actually the most important thing. So just like wildlife habitat and water and all the important things that forests provide, carbon is another one. It is not the only one, and it should not be the driver of anything you do. So it should be the focus, as you probably already have, on healthy, resilient, productive forests, and decide what you want for your forest. And hopefully there'll be funding and technical assistance to drive whatever that is that you want for your forest. And forest markets for wood products can and should be a part of the climate solution. So I'm going to stop there and answer any questions you have. And I thank you for letting me talk.
Well, great. Thank you, Edie. Once again, oops. So you did answer a few questions as they came in. I don't see any at the moment, but I wanted to just highlight, you had a chart in there, a pie chart of the wood product distribution, and 50% of it was the sawed timber. You made the case for why that is in Washington, and those other pieces for the rest of you on the webinar is what Marcus Kaufman is pretty much an expert in. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of it's about capturing some of the wood residues and some of this other material mm-hmm. that comes off of that saw timber process. But I think he was also going to touch on some other aspects. And one of the drivers right now that I think has potential, and maybe Edie, you can speak to this, is the it's called the RED certification process for architects and builders. And I know there's been a lot of investment down in Oregon for mass timber facilities. Can you kind of speak to how that kind of plays into the carbon market?
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And if you recall from my sort of summary slide of the incentive programs, that gap on the recognition that wood products are a climate solution, and that you actually, the more wood products you have, the more likelihood you're going to have forests and productive forests, and kind of it's a lever that is a really important one to as I like to call, priming the carbon sequestration pump. It's the direct carbon payment for building with wood is not there right now. However, there is a big recognition in the building world that innovative products like mass timber are kind of a win-win for climate. And so that demand then is kind of spurring the whole thing. Whether or not that's enough to move the dial is a question. You know, not everything has to be done in tons of carbon. Some of it can just be done in terms of demand for wood products. But that's definitely a big trend here especially in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, so we've had a few questions filter in here. This one from Ken: would an owner of, say, 40 acres be able to take advantage of some of these carbon markets, still do regeneration harvests every 40 to 70 years, or would they necessarily have to do smaller harvests stretched out over a longer time period?
So yeah, that's a great question. And I would say it kind of depends. So 40 acres is usually a one harvest scenario, right? So you're either about to harvest or you kind of harvest it all at once. And I would say in the traditional carbon markets, that one will be a little bit harder to bring on and do a harvest during that carbon piece. I know that it definitely is something that a lot of these carbon aggregators are trying to consider. So perhaps they have a way such that you've got a 40-acre stand, you're gonna grow it to, let's call 60 years. That's allowing someone else, you know, time to do their harvest. And then when it's your turn to do a harvest, you've raised the dial. So there are some ways that you could probably get in a carbon aggregator side. I will tell you from the family forest carbon ownership side, any size plot will work, because what you're doing is you're comparing your starting point to the FIA plots that have the same starting point, and then you're doing something, you're trying to beat them. You're basically trying to, you know, however it is you're going to do with whatever practice. So that will be an option, with the one caveat that it's not out here in the West yet. So.
Right. Yeah. Like most things, there's a lot of variables, you know, and of course the whole west side, east side scenario can change things. I got another question. This one from Dennis. What are some ways consulting foresters stay on top of the many facets of potential carbon offsets? I'm just going to plug right in there as a consulting forester. That's why I invited Edie, because I think she's got the broad depth of all that. So hopefully you guys liked her presentation, and we'll have her back to keep us updated.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean,
elaborate.
It is definitely a moving target, and I would say it's super confusing. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the latest forestry source just featured 2 programs related to this, and there's Western Forester is going to come out with another issue on carbon. I do know that I think it's called the National Association of Consulting Forests, are putting on some discussions about this. So that might be, you know, Nick, what I'll do is I'll send you whatever information I have. I don't have it at the top of my head, but that's certainly a way to try to keep informed. And also, yeah, you know, I'm happy to, you can talk to me if you want. I'm not a project developer myself. I know the
Yeah.
protocols, but I know enough of the players to kind of know what some of the options are. So. All right, let's see. Drone technology. Yes. Okay. So here's the deal of all of this is like my vision of the future is that the measuring and monitoring costs, so there are two barriers, I think, to currently to the carbon projects as they are. One, going out and measuring these plots take time and expense. You guys know that. And that there's going to be a huge amount of innovation, drones, satellite imagery, smartphones, what have you, that's going to help reduce that, that cost. The second one, which still needs a little more work, and it's really in regards to innovative finance, is that there are certain practices that cost a lot up front, but the carbon kind of comes later. And they're really important to do. In fact, I think they're the ones that are the ones from a silvicultural perspective are the ones that we should be doing. We shouldn't just be doing the not cutting a tree, even though that's equally important. But there's some ways to increase forest health that do have some cost associated with them. And so there's some work being done to try to figure out how you can essentially align the incentive payment goes first, but the carbon credit comes a little bit later, and have that be okay.
And then I think there is one last question out. Or maybe it was just a statement, sorry.
Yeah.
So much to think about. Yes, definitely. So I'm gonna post in the chat box now the link to the survey. And I think we'll wrap up at this point. Once again, thank you, Edie, for joining us. If you would like Edie's contact information, they're in the bios under the events page on the Tree Farm site. It's been linked in the newsletter, I believe. Reminder emails, you can Google Three Trees Consulting, I'm sure she'll pop up. Again, we'll be posting this once we get Marcus's presentation put together, post that on the Washington Tree Farm site. Please consider donating. That button also is, or the link is also in your e-newsletter. And if you need continuing education credits, please make sure you fill out section 2 of the survey. Our final session is next Wednesday at September 9th, same bat time, 3:30. And we'll have presentations on growing mushrooms and making syrup. And you don't want to miss the latest research and development of specialized forest products. And with that, we will close it out. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much.